free peasant agriculture. And no, it's not like someone standing outside of Walmart with a box of peasants, free peasants. The mama peasant had babies and we can't keep them all. No, that's not it at all. Free peasant meaning peasants who have the freedom to move about wherever. They're not like serfs who are stuck on the land. And the important part here about free peasant labor is that these free peasants are going to live under increasingly terrible pressure because lots of them are dying and lots of them are moving up in the world and are no longer subject to having to pay labor taxes because they moved to, I guess, like a new tax bracket. Specifically in the Byzantine Empire, we see the military elite grabbing lots of power in the theme system, if you remember us talking about that before. And the military elite begin to force new forms of taxation on the free peasants. This makes the peasants really unhappy and will create fewer recruits over time for military service. And it makes it tougher if you're collecting higher taxes, and more often it's going to make the tax rate decrease. And this creates major fiscal problems for the Byzantine government as well as the governments in post-classical China. If you're not sure what I'm talking about with free peasants and free peasant agriculture in China, go back and read the poems of Du Fu, where he's talking about how they have to pay high taxes. Taxes are too high, rent's too high, I have to go fight off in wars, right? Other forms of labor organization that we've talked about previously: nomadic pastoralism, craft production, and guild organization in Europe. Now, craft production and guild organization in Europe is important because guilds regulate the amount of money and the quality of particular trades in Europe. So for example, you have like the Dyers Guild, and everyone that wants to dye fabric for a living has to go through a particular training program, prove themselves to be a master dyer, complete a masterpiece, and then prove that they can set up shop and be able to charge people money. The same reasons why you would like join a guild in an MMO, right? You join a guild in a multiplayer game online because you want to be able to collaborate with people, share supplies, techniques, work on larger raids and stuff together. Just like guild organization in Europe. If everyone that is working in silver in a particular town ensures that everybody is highly trained and is working up to the same level of professionalism, then you can basically charge the exact same high rates and be able to ensure that no one is getting cheated or doing anything kind of shady. There, in the Islamic world, there are all sorts of different forms of unfree labor, including, if you guys recall, the beginnings of African laborers working on sugar plantations in the Islamic world. In the Incan Empire, we have the Maita system, which are government-imposed labor taxes. And actually, the Midas system, we'll talk about that more in the next time period. That's going to be established by the, that's going to be taken over by the Spanish, which is kind of fascinating. And the last form of labor organization that we've talked about are military obligations, drafting people into the military, like in the Byzantine Empire, in Europe, in various Chinese dynasties. Hopefully, go back to that Du Fu poem that we read, The Ballad of War Wagons. And that poem in particular hits on how heavy the tax burden is for Chinese peasants, how heavy the burdens are of military service. And overall, during this time period, because of this increase in agricultural production, changing technologies, as well as people demanding more trade goods, this is going to mean that there's going to be a greater demand for slaves, not only for military purposes, but for also purposes of production. Actually, one of the things about guild organizations that's kind of important is that there are 3 steps in European guild organization, and until you prove yourself as a master, you actually pay to be schooled by a master, and you actually have to pay to work. So it's a bit like being an intern. I hope that helped and made sense. I feel kind of bad. The last thing that we need to talk about is how social structures are shaped by changes in class and caste. We're also going to continue to see patriarchy be a big deal, but in other places we'll see women actually have power and influence. That's right, something nice happens for women. What? In particular among the Mongols, as well as in West Africa, Japan, and Southeast Asia. So to begin talking about India, the changes and continuities in the caste system in particular are because of the influx of Turks and Muslims coming to India. So what this means is that in order to kind of figure out what happens with these new populations, we see something called jati develop. And these are basically sub-clans that begin to develop within the caste system. And within these sub-clans, they begin to be associated with particular professions. And in a lot of ways, your caste begins to act a lot like a merchant guild that I talked about on the last slide in Europe. And as trade expands in India to the south, the caste system extends even further south. In the north, the caste system is kind of more important than in the south, and as northern merchants have more contact with people in the south, then people in the south begin to adapt to those northern caste practices. Remember, it's a lot like how people convert to various religions for one reason or another through trade. In nomadic societies, our example for nomadic societies are the Mongols. Pretty much overall, like every other nomadic society that we've talked about, the Mongols have two levels of class structures. You have nobles and you have commoners. You're able to gain status by being awesome at something and having your own Cinderella story, or you could have, some sort of epic failure and lose status and become a commoner. And so it just depends on your conduct and skill and overall abilities. In West Africa serves as a place in which we see women having more power and influence. In particular, women are very influential in public affairs. They own property in many places. In particular, women are merchants within marketplaces and have a certain amount of better protection than in other places pre-existing. Also, keep in mind that in some places, how families are structured are going to be remarkably different. In some places in West Africa, they have something called age grades, in which everyone is grouped together by age. So sort of like how you're grouped into grades here at school, right? Everyone here is essentially grouped by model year when you think about it, right? So everyone that's a sophomore was born around the same year. And once grouped into those age grades, you would perform certain tasks to ensure that you are moving forward towards your goal of becoming a fully integrated man or woman within your particular group, which is kind of interesting. In other places, I need to talk about property. Okay. So not only in some places in Africa do they have age grades, we also have different attitudes towards private property. So for example, the land belongs to everybody and everybody uses it collaboratively. That's kind of important. And just like how some places also share land, other places also share power. And so we see village councils in some places in sub-Saharan Africa that may or may not include women. So, patriarchy. Patriarchy continues on, right? Because girls aren't made of sugar and spice and everything nice. Like Taylor says in my 6th period, women are made out of darkness and death and blood and sin. I'm not kidding. Anyway, in China, we're going to see patriarchy tighten up even further during the Song period. We see people choose more conservative roles for men and women during periods of social and economic unrest, and the post-classical periods in China are no exception. These conservative and male-dominated patterns of thinking are going to remain popular and culturally prominent. And that's one of the reasons why Buddhism is particularly rejected in China, because Buddhism does not make those kind of gender, they don't promote those differentiation for gender, as people would like within Chinese society. In particular, because some women are able to become nuns and they have these alternative routes outside of traditional roles within the home and family. Popular thought, not just in China, but also in Europe as well. We see that most places do advocate for the confining of women, in particular to preserve their virginity as well as fidelity. Widows are expected to remain chaste unless they choose to remarry, or they live in a culture where they are allowed to remarry. But the double standard, for men is going to persist, in which we see a growth in premarital sex through an overall growth in prostitution, like all of those. Like all of the brothels that we talked about growing in Chang'an, as well as the practice of keeping concubines, and also the possibility of remarriage for men rather than women. The best example of, I guess the best physical example of patriarchy within China is going to be foot binding. And foot binding is where women's feet are bound up very tightly in cloth in order to make sure that they remain very small and have this significantly high arch. Foot binding begins at about 5 or 6. It keeps women confined. It's very painful, and it's not only symbolic of women's societal constriction in China, but it is also physically constricting them. I'm not going to post pictures of foot binding because they're really disturbing. Feel free to Google that, because I feel kind of ill when I look at bound feet. And finally, women's roles in Southeast Asia. One of the awesome things for many women in Southeast Asia, so we're talking like Laos, Vietnam, Java, we will see women dominate local and regional marketplaces. And what ends up happening, as trade with Asia increases because of the Indian Ocean trade, women take on these new prominent roles, especially when trading with outsiders, because there aren't any mechanisms to get men of different classes and races together in order to be able to converse and trade, because women are outside of those power structures and they're already trading in these markets anyway. We see these women being able to actively get into business ventures with outsiders, which is kind of cool. Also in Japan, again, women have a lot more openness and access to education and the ability to kind of have a place outside of the home. The best example of this is The Tale of Genji, which I told you about before, is the first novel. And the important piece about The Tale of Genji is that the woman who wrote this, Lady Murasaki, she gets into the how and why of what Genji does. It's not just, like Genji is kind of, free with his physical affection for women. Work that out, okay? So Genji is, physically intimate with lots of people, but in fact, Murasaki takes Genji's sort of freeness with inner personal relations and really deconstructs the fact that he is emotionally scarred by this failed relationship with a woman. And this failed relationship with this woman is why he acts the way that he does until he finally falls in love. And so she's really getting into the psychological reasons for why people do what they do. And that's very fascinating. And Murasaki is very famous within her own time for publishing The Tale of Genji. And it's a really big deal. And this is in contrast to Western Europe, where women are not doing anything. I mean, they are, but they're not supposed to, I guess. I don't know. I'm becoming increasingly inarticulate. Sorry. And the last part that we need to talk about is how the diffusion of our major world religions and philosophies, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and Neo-Confucianism, leads to significant changes in gender relations. So, firstly, Islam has lots of good news for women. Number one, the Quran enhances the security of women within Arabian society. Infanticide, killing female children, is not allowed. Dowries go to brides rather than their husbands. And the dowry is something that the bride keeps if there's ever a divorce or a death of a husband or anything like that. That dowry is for her. And so women are able to support themselves and have property that their husbands don't control. The Quran also portrays women as honorable rather than property, and that within the Quran, women and men are equal in God's eyes. And that's really important because the bad news for women is that a lot of people misread and don't understand those elements of Islam, as with many other world religions. And so we see Sharia law and certain interpretations of the Quran reinforce male dominance and patriarchy. In many places, we see the societies go from being matrilineal, meaning that your descent is through your mother and your grandmother, actually become through the male line. So who's your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather? Also, in a lot of other places, particularly Africa and Asia and other matriarchal societies, with the introduction of Islam, we also see now the social and sexual lives of women are under strict control of male guardians. And this is regulated by the state because Sharia law is not only religious, but it's also the government as well. Other stuff, for example, additions to the Quran allow for up to 4 wives, but it is important to know that you have to, if you want to marry additional women, you have to prove that you have the income to support 4 laws. But what is interesting is that we also see the adoption of veiling from the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. So in a lot of places, wearing of veils and hijabs and other headscarves and stuff are not traditionally associated with Islam. But what's interesting, especially today, is when we talk about veiling and the hijab, that a lot of women see it as being liberating because it's a choice that women can now freely make. And I think that's what's really interesting when we're talking about the intersection of women's rights and religion. So really make sure that you guys are reading the passages that I assigned to you from the Quran and Sharia law, because you'll see that the Quran and Sharia law gives specific rights for women, but that in some places where there are very progressive protections for women, there are also equally unprogressive and very backwards limitations on women as well. So it really just depends on where you live and which interpretation of the Quran and in which scholars that you're listening to, just like in Christianity as well. So Buddhism. Buddhism gives Chinese women all sorts of new career options and changes social norms. And if you guys read the document The Lives of Nuns, you have to look at how the Chinese object to Buddhism because Buddhism is not from China. The Buddhists answer this objection through several different ways. And what I'd like for you guys to do is to be able to look at how Buddhism changes the pre-existing patriarchal social norms that existed in China. So think about how Buddhism takes Chinese patriarchy and changes it, in particular with nuns. That's what you should get from there. Christianity also has much the same option because women are able to become nuns as well. The best and first example of women becoming nuns is Saint Scholastica, whose brother was Saint Benedict. And Saint Scholastica adapts her brother Saint Benedict's rules for becoming a monk to becoming rules for becoming nuns and for one to be able to effectively run a convent. And that's why there are stories, like Shakespeare, get thee to a nunnery. So if you can't get married and you can't get your act together, a nunnery is a place where you can go and straighten out your life and dedicate yourself to God, especially in Western Europe. The last thing, still in China, or returning to China from Buddhism, is Neo-Confucianism. And Neo-Confucianism is, again, people revisiting the philosophies of Confucius and reinterpreting them for the purposes of post-classical Chinese culture. And in particular, Neo-Confucianism is very conservative, especially when compared to the Buddhist perspective on the roles of women outside of the home and traditional gender roles. But it's weird because a lot of elements of Neo-Confucianism are blended with Buddhism, so that way people will convert from Buddhism to becoming Confucians again. It's really interesting. And one of the I I'm still having trouble unpacking that because they take all of the things that people like about Buddhism and they add them to Confucianism and they repackage it for all of the sort of post-classical needs. But at the same time, it loses those progressive elements of Buddhism, like, for example, not having prejudice against a person because of their gender. And it's kind of fascinating to see how all of that works out. So be sure that you've read The Lives of Nuns. That's kind of a big deal document. And this is our last slide. Hopefully I made sense. If I didn't make sense, you should email me or come to tutoring, because I get paid to answer your questions. And I want to answer your questions. Yeah.